Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a nice break. I realize some of you probably were working full time, and maybe some of you were catching up on some of your schoolwork. So I understand it wasn't a complete break for everybody, but I hope that the little bit of a reprieve from new work and classes helped. Now I'm starting to run out of silly hats, so I'm resorting to this kind of dollar store kids pirate thing here. And I actually do have an eye patch, but trying to kind of read my screen and talk to you with an eye patch is a bit difficult. So hopefully this is credible enough, or at least silly enough, because really silly is what I'm going for here. So our topic this week is human language, and I thought this would be a great way to start the second half of the semester. The first half of the semester, we focused largely on evolutionary things, so changes over time, and many of those weeks were spent focusing on the biological side, even though we were always, I was always reminding folks of that biocultural approach where we look at humans as biological beings, which we are, but we're also cultural beings. So as we move it, and then towards the end, we were looking more at cultural changes, but still kind of looking at that evolutionary aspect. I think that language is a really good transition into the more the part of the course where we're dealing more with like contemporary societies, and we're still going to go back to some of the stuff about evolution because the holistic perspective means that everything's connected, but we're still going to be focusing more on contemporary cultures around the world, and language kind of helps bridge that gap, and we're going to see why. So this is based on chapter 15. Why is understanding human language important? And as usual, the quiz is due on Thursday night. So, language. What is it? It's a communication system, right? It's not the only communication system in the world, but it's the main one that humans use, and it consists of these rules about how symbols are put together to convey meaning. Now, you might be going, wait a minute, Jackie, what do symbols actually have to do with language? Symbols are this other thing. And actually, what are symbols? Symbols include anything that represents something else, okay, in which the meaning is learned and shared. So that can be an image, like on a bathroom door. You have these little symbols for people of different genders very often that represent, and we know, like, we could. Somebody who didn't know that this little person symbol on a door meant that there was a bathroom there might be like, wow, is that a closet full of people? Right? Because it's, if we grew up in a society where we know that if there's a person symbol on a door, it means, unless there's an arrow going up and down, which means it's an elevator, otherwise we know it means a bathroom, right? But we have to learn that. Right? So that's the thing with symbols, is that you have to learn the meaning, and a group of people have to share it. You can decide on your own that this pen represents, I don't know, love or hate or, anything really. But if you're the only person in the world that knows what that means to you, then it's not shared meaning. You'd show people the pen and they wouldn't know what you were referring to. So all that said, like what symbols mean, that they represent something else and the meaning is learned and shared, that applies to the words that we use. Okay? So words are symbols. So that's why we can say that language is a communication system, and that consists of rules about how symbols are put together to convey meaning. Because that's essentially what language is we have words, and we have, each language has its own rules about how you put things together to convey a certain message that is meaningful. Okay? And so linguistic anthropology is, a subfield we haven't talked about much yet this semester, but we learned about it in the very first week. My hat's crooked. I think I'm going to be doing that a lot in the next half hour. Is the subfield of anthropology that focuses on language and how it's linked to the rest of the human experience. Now, some of you might, maybe you have relatives or something that are studying or who are professors or something. You might have heard of linguistics on its own as a field. And yes, linguistics is its own field. And it's a fascinating field. And that really digs in on the structure of languages and how languages are related. So linguistic anthropology is a subfield of anthropology, but that has links with the field of linguistics on its own. So in linguistic anthropology, we're really kind of bridging that gap where we're taking some stuff from the field of linguistics and looking at how it's linked to other aspects of the human experience. So within, as we saw with biological anthropology, there are different sub fields within that, right? Like paleoanthropology, primatology, things like that. Well, linguistic anthropology has its own subfields as well, and this is annoying. I'm sorry, I'm going to go without this for this week, and I'm just going to switch back to one of my old classics, if that's all right with you. I'll have to get a better pirate thing. There we go. So here are some different areas of focus within linguistic anthropology. So there's historical linguistics, so looking at the changes in language over time. So if any of you have ever seen one of those language trees, where they're looking at all these different families of languages and how they're related, it's a fascinating field. And so, they can kind of trace back how different languages are related. And we'll talk a little bit later about change in languages over time. Descriptive linguistics is the one that is less obviously connected to anthropology, but there are some connections. It's just, it might be less obvious to somebody who's first starting to learn about it. And descriptive linguistics is really digging into the analysis of the structures of languages and comparing the structures of languages in terms of their grammars, not the kind of grammar that you learn like in elementary and high school, right? But just the way that the language is formed, and that varies from language to language and between different language families, and those structures are very much aligned with cultural worldviews. And so that's very much beyond the scope of this course, because you really get into a lot of the technical stuff, and I'm not really qualified to teach to that level because I haven't specialized in linguistics. So that's like really, you could take courses in this and you could get a whole degree in this. And sociolinguistics is something that'll kind of come up from time to time in our course, because that's that's one of the ones that's most obviously tied to some of the stuff we're going to talk about. So, for example, sociolinguists like to learn about social norms about language use. And this is something that pretty much everybody winds up being familiar with. We know that sometimes we'll observe tendencies for people in different social categories to use language differently. And there are different social expectations around that. So we talked about the concept of socialization and culturation back when we talked about how culture is learned. Well, part of that socialization is we learn how to express ourselves according to who we are. So, for example, our gender, right? Class, our social class. Regional dialects as well. So these are all things that people learn, and it's also things that come to be expected, or things we'll hear someone talk a certain way and we'll make certain assumptions about them. So whether they're rich or poor, whether they're educated or not, in different cultures, there are different expectations put on people of different genders in terms of how they express themselves. In mainstream North America, sociologists have observed, for example, that people who are socialized as female growing up, often they'll end their statements as though it were a question, because people assigned female at birth and socialized as women tend to be taught that they need to be more passive and not be too, affirmative. Whereas, people assigned male at birth and raised as male tend to be raised to be more aggressive. These are generalizations, right? They're not true across the board, but this is what the society kind of pushes on people. And therefore, men feel pressure to kind of state everything in a more affirming way because they're seen as weak if their statements in question. So things like that fall under the kind of the category of sociolinguistics. Then you have ethnolinguistics, which is kind of similar to sociolinguistics, but it's kind of more along the lines of worldviews and meaning and the extent that relationship between language and culture. So how does culture help shape language? But how can language also help shape culture? And that's something we'll touch on a little bit. The textbook goes into it a bit, but I find that they don't necessarily explain it in a way that's super accessible to a novice. So I'll just touch on it a bit. So human language, how is it distinctive? And by the way, the stuff that I just covered is kind of in the text in different spots, but if you're, the way I put together the PowerPoints is in a way that makes sense to me, and it doesn't always follow exactly how the textbook lines it up. But I felt that talking a bit about linguistics before jumping into the stuff kind of made sense. So human language, and so here, like, near the beginning of the chapters, is they have a whole section that talks about how, well, it doesn't talk, books don't talk. Don't write that in your essays, but we're just talking here, right? So there's a discussion in the textbook about what makes human language distinctive from ways that other animals, for example, communicate with each other, especially our closest relatives, which are non-human primates. So one of there's a whole, they talk about a whole bunch of them. I'm just going to talk about 3 here because we don't really have time to get into all 6, and the last 3 that they describe are a bit more abstract. So for our purposes, I think it's sufficient to talk about the first 3 that they talk about. So one of these things is openness. And so just to kind of help with the comparison, if we look at non-human primates, they communicate with each other. They have what's called a call system, which there are certain vocalizations that'll make that are attached to certain situations, like, hey, there's food over here, or hey, there's a predator. And they have very specific meanings, and they all kind of understand these instinctively. But those systems are closed, so there's only a limited number of messages they convey. They would, if they were in a, like the textbook mentions this, where if a chimp, for example, is in a situation both where there's a threat and there's food, they would have to, they would use one of the calls. They can't combine them to kind of create a sentence. Right? So they kind of have, it's a closed system. They can't create new meanings from the calls that they have. Whereas human language is an open system. There are no limits to the creation of new meanings, so we're always creating new sentences, for example, and you can understand a sentence that have, when you speak a language, we're talking about languages we're fluent here, right? So in the languages within which you're fluent, I think most people at Vanier speak at least 2. Some of you speak many more than 2. I've met students who've been able to speak 5, 6, 7 languages. So in each language that you are fluent in, if you hear a new sentence that you've never heard before, you'll still understand it if it fits within the codes of that language. And so an open system does that. You can always, you know the codes, you've learned you've grown up learning them and embodying them, so you can on the spot kind of create new sentences to create new meaning when you encounter new situations, and they're meaningful to the people who share a language with you. So that's one thing that sets our communication system apart from those of our closest relatives. Tied to that is this idea of displacement. I've talked a bit about this before when we're talking about evolution, but this is kind of very significant in our evolution, is that at one point with our brain growth, right, and our brains getting more complex, we started to be able to think symbolically in this way. And when we think, remember when we said symbols represent something else? Well, that thing that is represented doesn't have to be in the room, and it can also be an abstract thought. So with symbolic thinking and symbolic communication, if we're a group of people, prehistoric people, and 2 of us go scouting on the other side of the mountain and we see a herd of antelope that's like miles long, we can come back and talk about those antelope and, talk about them, and people will understand us if we have a shared word for what antelope means. Even if they can't see them, they know what we're talking about. That's displacement. We can talk about the past and the future. That's displacement. These are things that are not in front of us. We can talk about abstract ideas like love and hate and sadness and, different kinds of feelings or philosophies, even though we can't see them because they're not tangible things. So that's displacement, and it's very helpful for planning, strategizing, creating, sharing. And with all of that, that third feature that I think is one of the 3 most important ones for our purposes in this course is that meaning is arbitrary. So that's the thing with symbols, not just words, but any kind of symbol. Like I said before, anybody, you can decide that this represents something. So there's no natural and necessary link between a symbol and what it represents. So if I say cat, well, people who also speak English will know what I'm talking about, the animal that I'm talking about. But there's no natural connection between the sound cat and that animal. All right? And in related languages, you'll hear, there are similarities, like chat in French, gatto. I think in Italian and Spanish have a very similar way to say cat. in German it's Katze. So these are all related languages, so they have the same root. But somewhere else in the world, I'm sure in other languages, the word for cat doesn't sound anything like cat. In the textbook, they give the example of the sound boy, and in different languages, boy means different things, right? So there's no, nothing natural about the tree that I'm seeing outside my window that led to humans at some point calling it a tree, or whatever words led to tree in previous languages. So that's what we mean by arbitrary. And it's the same with a lot of symbols. Some symbols are very visual. So again, if you see, a drawing of a toilet on a door, you know what's behind it. It's a very direct, image. But then with the example of like putting a person, and a person that looks either masculine or feminine, to represent what kind of bathroom this is supposed to be, because in the West we're still kind of hung up on these binary genders, and that, oh my god, they have to pee in separate places because, oh my god, right, they're so different. These are Western categories that we have that we're hung up on. But at some point it was decided that symbol of a person meant a bathroom. So there's nothing about a bathroom that would make us think that a person would represent a place where we could go pee, because peeing is not the only thing that humans do in life, right? So symbols are arbitrary. Meaning is arbitrary. So those are things that set human languages apart. And I added this is tied to all of this. We can lie, all right? With the call system, animals for the most part aren't going to lie. That, like, if they're using a call, it's instinctive and it's related to the situation they're in, right? But because of displacement, and because of the openness of our language system, and because meaning is arbitrary, we can say things that are not true. I can say that I have short blonde hair. That sentence makes sense to you, even though you see clearly that it's not true, unless I was wearing a wig, but I swear I'm not. This is my real hair. I can lie and say it's 2 o'clock in the morning right now. It's not. It's daytime, and you can probably kind of see that it is. But who knows? Maybe I have some kind of special lamp with special lighting, right? But we can lie, and even though lying is not something we're taught is a nice thing to do, it's something that we're able to do because of these features of language. And you can get more if you want. If you're curious about the 3 other things that make human language distinctive from, say, the call systems of our non-human primate relatives, you can look at this page range in the textbook. So language and culture. First, before we go into more depth in that, I want to remind people of the biocultural approach. And, the biocultural approach, remember, what that means is that we approach everything looking at it from a biological point of view and a cultural point of view, and how they connect with each other. And we've talked about examples in evolution of this, and language actually has come up. And some of the things here we've already mentioned. So, for example, evolutionary speaking, when we talk about changes in our brain structure among hominins over time, and how it kind of really got even more complex with the members of the genus Homo habilis, and etc. That brain structure allowed for that capacity for symbolic thinking, right? And on top of that, like with changes in our anatomy that are linked with walking upright, that changed everything about our anatomy and our throat structure, our mouth structure. Again, our jaws and teeth got smaller over time, especially after Homo erectus started controlling fire and therefore cooking. Our food got softer, so the selection pressure for big teeth and jaws decreased, so this decreased in size. That allows us to move our jaws more easily and articulate things that earlier hominin species wouldn't have been able to. So between the shapes and structures of our mouths and throats and our brain structure, these are biological contributors to our ability to use language the way that we do today. Okay? But language is also rooted in culture. Language reflects the way of seeing the world that people have. Okay? And as we know, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of languages in the world, so thousands and thousands and thousands of cultures and worldviews. Okay? Some of them are related to each other, some of them are very different. And language also reflects other elements of culture. So if you were to ever take a course that was more about, specifically about language, you'd get into more of that stuff that we were saying earlier in terms of how does language reflect social relations, power relations in society, how people see the world, right? And right now, with the internet, you've grown up in a time where the internet was always there, but people of my generation, the internet's been around for maybe half of our lives. So we experience the shift, and we see how much more rapidly language changes now, because there's always changes in technology that we use, but also more people around the world are communicating with each other faster on concepts that maybe hadn't been even thought of 30, 40 years ago. So things happen. It's not that change didn't happen before, it's just happening faster now because we have faster means of communication. So words like selfie didn't exist 50 years ago, but now they're kind of common everyday words. If you're involved in the LGBT community at all, you know that there are often new terms that come out for different sexual orientations, different romantic orientations, different ways of relating, different ways of identifying one's gender, and those are reflecting this kind of greater liberty in the West right now, and in other places as well, that people feel of being able to kind of identify themselves in ways that go against what was typically considered the norm before. So things like that, how language kind of reflects other elements of culture. And if you look at some ethnography, sometimes you'll see how the language is structured and what words exist really reflect a lot about the way of seeing the world. So there's two kind of main streams of thought, or two ways that we can look at that connection, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. There's definitely this aspect that, culture shapes language. So what is present and important? What concepts exist in that worldview? Again, human relations, about gender and things like that. So in terms of what is present and important, you might have heard that thing about how Inuit people have many words for snow. And, there's something to that, because if your livelihood as a people has to do with the weather conditions, which a lot of us, we've grown up, there's these houses, it'll affect our life, whether, if it's snowing or raining, it'll affect how we dress up that day. But if you're living directly off the land, and what the changes in weather have to do with what kind of food you're going to be able to get and how you're going to get to that food and how you're going to bring it back, it becomes very, very important. So it makes sense to have a lot of words for that thing. When I lived in Iuisti, which is EU or Cree territory in northern Quebec, it was explained to me that there aren't that many words for flowers, but there are many, many words for different kinds of trees, because that's more, traveling a lot in a forested environment, that winds up being more of a marker for people for how to get around, what concepts exist. One thing, if you're interested in if you are Indigenous, and if you know your ancestral language, or you're learning it, or if you've learned anything about Indigenous languages from here, it's interesting, because instead of a lot of them, they're not all the same. There are many, many Indigenous languages, but for a lot of them, in terms of instead of really heavily focusing on gender, like in French, for example, nouns have genders, same thing in German and Italian, and a lot of languages do this. It's the crucial difference is more between whether something is animate or inanimate. And it's not only humans and animals that would be considered animate. Some things that Westerners would consider as just objects are considered to be animate. So that's reflected in the language, and that reflects a worldview. Language, so there's, if you go further into this, if you're really interested, the textbook describes it a bit, but at a very superficial level. There's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which has long been considered controversial, but largely because it was misunderstood. And so the idea is that language influences what we can even think of. And some people interpreted that to think that language completely shapes the way we think, and therefore we can't think of outside of our language. That obviously doesn't make sense, because then there would never be any cultural change or linguistic change. So if we can invent new symbols and new words, then obviously we can think outside of this parameters of the languages that we've learned growing up. But there is something to be said for the languages that we grow up with kind of helping to shape our worldview as well. So For example, coming back to gender, if you're raised in a society where you grow up and the language that you learn only has words for two genders, it's going to be incredibly hard later on to kind of grip the fact that maybe there are more than two. Whereas in languages where there are more than two genders in the language, then it's easier to conceive of the idea that there are more than two. So when we see these changes happen, some people resist the changes of, acknowledging, okay, well, you can have like a non-binary category, or you can have other kinds of terms for different kinds of genders. You can have gender-neutral pronouns. Some people resist that because they were raised to think a certain way, and that has a lot to do with clinging to a way of speaking. So the language here is, in addition to a worldview, has very much shaped their thinking. Whereas obviously people who know, either as they're growing up from a very young age, as is the case for a lot of us who are, trans or non-binary, whereas some people discover it later on in their life, they know instinctively, but if their language doesn't have words for it, it becomes a big struggle to express who they are, right? So that connection between language, culture, worldview is very, very strong. So the next thing that I want to talk about here that I think is interesting, and when we're in class I like to do exercises on this, and it's really a fun topic because language is something we use constantly, whether just in our heads or how we communicate, whether it's online or in person. We're always involved in some kind of communication. Now, nonverbal communication is something that has a big role in our lives as well. Now, just to clear up confusion, this is extra that I'm telling you. It's not something that they go over in the textbook, but people often confuse nonverbal communication with sign language. Now, I have a few friends who are deaf or hard of hearing and who communicate primarily through sign language, and they always remind me and other people that sign languages are languages with their own structures, just like English or any other language. So it's not so much translating English or French or whatever other language into signs. It's, and you even have different sign languages, right? You have American Sign Language, or ASL. You have Langue des Signes du Québec, LSQ. You have other, and so they have their own systems, and it's so that's not what we're talking about when we talk about nonverbal communication. Sign language is a language just like spoken languages in terms of their structures and communicative devices. They look different. They're not verbal, but that's not what we're talking about when we talk about nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication happens alongside language, whether it's spoken language or sign language. If you've ever seen a sign language interpreter, by the way, if you watch a speech by, Justin Trudeau or whoever, and they have, interpreters there to interpret into sign language, the really good ones, you'll often see they're making facial expressions to add meaning to what they're saying with their hands, just in the same way that when we talk, we also have facial expressions. A lot of us, not everybody, right? But a lot of us will have facial expressions that go along with our language, in addition to gestures or other things, right? So nonverbal communication doesn't replace spoken language. It's not just this thing that we do if we can't speak for some reason. If you're across a crowded room, you might signal to somebody like, hey, I'm over here, and they won't hear you, so you have to make these big gestures. These are not the only situations in which we'll use nonverbal communication. We're always using nonverbal communication, and in fact, according to the authors of our textbook, we communicate about 60% of the meaning that we convey through nonverbal communication, either intentionally or unintentionally. Okay, so we don't always notice we're doing it. So when you're raised to say, we grow up sometimes, depending on what culture you grew up in, but definitely here in the West, at least in my generation, there was things like hold your back straight, otherwise you're giving the meaning that you lack confidence, look at people in the eye, otherwise it means you're lying, and a lot of that is unfortunately kind of oppressive. Some folks who are autistic, myself included, have a hard time looking people in the eye because the energy is very hard to handle for us. it doesn't mean we're lying. And there are cultures where it's considered rude to look people in the eye. So it's a very kind of, it's a cultural thing. So the meaning of nonverbal communication is as cultural as the meaning of words in a language. But we're taught that growing up, that this, so some of the things wind up being on purpose. You're like, if you go into a job interview, you might be telling yourself, I have to hold my back straight, I have to make sure to look a person in the eye, I have to give a firm handshake, blah blah blah, because these are all things that convey certain messages. But a lot of our body language is unintentional. Nonverbal communication, I should say, because body language is only one type of nonverbal communication. So a lot of our nonverbal communication, we have very little control over. It just kind of happens alongside the rest of our communication. And like I said, it's all culturally relative, right? So you might have heard the thing of like, here in the West, if you go like this, it means A-OK, right? But in some cultures, you're insulting somebody and telling them that they're a big zero. So different. That's the thing when you travel. If you travel somewhere new, one of the things you have to find out is what are things that are considered offensive to other people. Otherwise, you can get into a whack load of trouble. Because if somebody comes to you and they give you the finger, so you're a Westerner and you've been raised to see this as very rude. If somebody does it to you and then you find out afterwards that they're from a different culture and it means something different to them, you might be like, oh, okay. But in the moment, you might get really like, hey, I didn't do anything to this person. Why are they giving me the finger, right? So we have to be very careful when we go to other places to try to avoid doing things like that, because some people will be understanding especially if you tell them, oh, I'm not from here, and you try to say something in their language and they realize, okay, this person is clearly not from here. But not everybody is that gracious. As we know, some people get violent very fast. Be careful. So nonverbal communication. There's more than one type. So body language is often the first thing that comes to people's minds when we talk about nonverbal communication, but it's not the only kind. Most people are familiar with this. So gestures, right? So you wave at somebody, hello or goodbye, giving the finger, the okay gesture, again, depending on the culture. So, where I lived up north in Iuisi, and a lot of indigenous folks around here do the thing where they point with their lower lip instead of with their finger, often for practical reasons. They're carrying stuff, so right? That's meaningful. Facial expressions, a smile, a wink, a frown, that kind of thing, right? This is all body language, and we're doing this while we're communicating either verbally or with sign language or sometimes silence. Sometimes you do use body language just on its own. Other senses, so smells and taste communicate meaning, right? So cultures attach certain meanings to things like this. So, that's, again, very culturally relative. So people will kind of sometimes even actively use these things. It's like, new age, you walk into a new age store, they're going to maybe be burning certain kinds of incense to give you that meaning of, oh, you're in a spiritual place here, right? Vocal sounds that are not words. So a cry or a laugh, if I go, ha, right? It's like conveying a certain meaning. And one thing, it's not in the slides, and I don't talk about it much in the book, but our nonverbal communication, whether it's body language or these other things, they can, when we said earlier that we can lie because of our open system, it's the same thing here. We can make a facial expression or a gesture that's the opposite of what we're saying. We can do this intentionally, or sometimes if we're trying to lie, but our body language betrays us. So if I'm telling you, like, I'm really happy right now, you might not believe me, right? Because my body language isn't matching, or, There's also how people use space. This is a communicative device too, because you might know this if you've grown up elsewhere, or if you've traveled, or if you have family that live in, different cultures, where, how close you are to other people and whether you touch them or not So there here, in the West, there are, there have been studies about like different degrees of distance. So if you're intimate with someone, you're at a certain distance. If you're friends with them, if they're an acquaintance, if they're a stranger, that there are these different socially accepted distances. And it's not like you measure them, you just kind of feel it. And so people who feel like their personal space has been invaded, they'll tend to back up and, but that's different in different cultures. And it's also very gendered in the West, right? So, for example, people who are women, assigned female at birth, or trans women, or there's an expectation that it's more okay for them to be close to each other and even touch each other, even if they're not sexually involved with each other. Whereas there's kind of this thing where men aren't supposed to, if they touch each other, it's supposed to be this more rugged, like, hey, hell, this bro hug or whatever. And part of that touches on homophobia and ideas about sexuality, but it's also it's something that's acquired through learning a worldview and ways of communicating. So definitely the use of space. Just even like you go to some European countries and it's normal for even heterosexual men to give each other kisses on the cheek, whereas in the West that's seen as something that women and men do to each other, and women can do to each other, but men can't kiss man, right? Like, oh my god, right? So it's these are images from the book, like when I was talking about the social distance thing. So this is like an illustration of one study, and you can find this in the textbook, where they're kind of showing the degrees depending on how connected you are with someone. There's an example of body language with Maori, which is indigenous people of New Zealand, which is a common form of greeting. And then this also is, young people. There's generational differences too. Here, these guys are kind of casual. They kind of look like university students, hang around in the hallway. You see some body language there, right? Like you can act, even if you're stressed, you're a giant ball of anxiety, which a lot of us are. You're not alone if you're feeling like a giant ball of anxiety. And look at this guy here with the white t-shirt. He's looking really relaxed. He might be a bundle of anxiety inside, but we know what it means to look relaxed. And sometimes we can make ourselves look relaxed even when we're not, because it doesn't look cool to not look relaxed, right? So you can see some body language there, but also in terms of like there's expectations in terms of the formality of how we speak with each other in different contexts. That's just another area that it's not specific to nonverbal communication, but just communication in general. So just, we're nearing the end here. So just in terms of the origins of spoken language in particular, sometimes people will wonder, well, where did language even come from? So like I was saying before, and that I've mentioned before, thanks to our evolving brain structure, once you get to the genus Homo, with Homo habilis, Homo erectus, you start to have more complex brains than existed before. So there's probably beginnings of some symbolic thinking there. But as we also saw when we talked about Neanderthals a few weeks back, they're saying that the ability for use of language is likely to have existed because you see examples of other symbolic behaviors like burying the dead, for example, for maybe spiritual reasons. And once you have that system in place, it's clear that there's some kind of communication going on because these are learned behaviors. Somebody has to explain it to you, and to even think of the concept that there might be a soul and that this soul lives on, and that as the living you have to honor the dead and make sure that their soul goes to the right place by burying them properly and with the right things. These are all things that need to be communicated. So, we talked about call systems before. So, there's some evidence that even closely related primates have some limited capacity for symbolic thinking, maybe a little bit of displacement. So not to the extent that we do, but maybe a limited capacity. And, they've been able to teach some of them some, human aspects of human language, certain words that they can recognize by hearing them, certain signs as well. But it's still limited, and it's unlikely that they can kind of create new symbols. As far as we know, right? Science is always changing, and there's always new things. So 20 years ago, it was thought that only humans were capable of symbolic thinking, and now we know differently. So you never know. In 20 years, it might be different. So in terms of individual languages, if you go around the world, and eventually we'll talk about this, is like people's own origin stories and how they explain the existence of their people. Well, a lot of people around the world, they'll kind of have oral traditions around where they came from, but also where their language came from. And often that's from the land in which they see themselves as having emerged. So depending on the perspective you take, there are different kind of ways of looking at the origins of language. And one interesting thing we talked about, in the last couple of weeks, we talked about archaeology, and one thing that came up was this whole idea of prehistory, and how prehistory usually is used by historians to talk about periods that existed before there was writing. But as anthropologists, we kind of go, hey, that didn't happen everywhere, and it didn't happen where it did happen, it didn't happen everywhere at the same time. So it's kind of misleading to talk about prehistory as though everything was the same thing everywhere on the planet. And even, it's really important to remember that writing is not a sign of being more advanced. Unfortunately, there's a stigma against people who are illiterate in the West. A lot of societies, up until, say, the past half century, relied on an oral tradition. And oral traditions are very rich and require a range of specialized skills. So, for example, indigenous peoples here, indigenous peoples on the African continent or the Australian continent, like, they were not stupid just because they didn't have a writing system, okay? There's a lot of knowledge that has been passed down for thousands of generations about the environment, about how to survive in this environment, about the language, about the culture, about values, about the history. So it doesn't mean that people are less advanced. It's just a different way of record keeping. And there are other things that accompany oral tradition. So, for example, locally, if you look at the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a confederacy of 6 First Nations. Originally there were 5, now there are 6, including the local Ganyankahaga, or Mohawk peoples. They had, like the wampum belt was something that would signify, a kind of treaty between people, a relationship between peoples who agreed to certain things, ways of sharing territory, ways of being allies with each other and engaging in trade. So these were symbolic things that also recorded things, even without actual writing. Now, in terms of the creation of writing, you started to have the first forms of written documentation were just kind of probably these quite simple graphic representations of things. And then later on, symbols actually representing units of speech. So the writing systems that we're familiar with today, maybe about 8,600 years ago, you start to see kind of some emerge in different parts of the world. And of course, there have been many others since then. Now, in terms of changes in languages over time, it's a little bit like speciation, when we saw new species get created over time as populations split and continue to adapt. It's the same thing with languages. New populations have split up and migrated to different spots, and over time their language changes and becomes a separate language. And, historical linguists can trace these relationships back because they can see which words are similar, and just like with genes, they can trace back to common ancestor languages. And the very last thing, and we're almost running out of time here, pidgin languages. These are languages that are precursors to Creole languages. They're kind of a transition, but they emerge often in contexts of domination. So if you have colonizers coming in and taking over, and obviously the people who are being colonized and the colonizers speak their own primary languages, but they have to find ways to understand each other. So often these pidgin languages emerge that are new, complex languages of their own. They're not inferior. They're used in communication between these two populations as the kind of second language. Often they'll take vocabulary, so words from the dominant language, but the structure of the subordinate language. So they're very interesting to linguists because you see them in action as they're being formed. Unfortunately, often they get judged. So especially the dominant population will judge the pidgin language, or even, of course, the subordinate language as being inferior. There's no such thing as a less sophisticated or inferior language. That's like calling people primitive. We don't do that in anthropology. So there's ethnocentrism, and then there's linguistic ethnocentrism, which is judging a language by the standards of one's own language. In the States, you see that a lot with a lot of white people, educated white people, judging what's called African American vernacular English, which is spoken by some but not all African Americans, and it's just a different way of speaking, but it's just as rich grammatically as standard English. It doesn't mean people are dumb, okay? So in kind of these colonial languages, you have that standard accepted form, and often there's stigma attached to any other form of speaking. Language loss. There's been many languages lost in the past 500 years, many of them indigenous, often due to colonization and the result of domination. English has become one of these colonizing languages, unfortunately, so that's a lot of knowledge that's lost with language loss. So that's very unfortunate. You can see a map here of language families of Indigenous Canada, for example. So a lot of languages here. Each of these language families has hundreds of languages. Well, not always hundreds, but some of them have hundreds of variations. But fortunately, there are people working hard to revive their languages. There are 20 seconds left, but there you go. Different efforts to revive languages that are nearly lost or even lost. And you can chat with me about that if you're curious to know more about how that works. So welcome back again. And if you have any questions, you know how to reach me.